The first-class cabin buzzed quietly as passengers settled into plush leather seats. Among them, Luther and Gloria Haywood, an elderly black couple, sat side by side. Luther, sharp in a charcoal suit, glanced at his wife, whose pale complexion had betrayed her exhaustion. "Excuse me," Luther said politely to the flight attendant Clara Reynolds. "Could I get a glass of water for my wife?" Clara barely glanced at them. "Water's served during meal service. You'll have to wait." Luther exchanged a knowing look with Gloria and quietly typed a message on his phone. Phase 1 activated. What was he planning? Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from. If you stand for justice and equality, don't forget to hit like and subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Luther Haywood sat quietly beside his wife, Gloria, his fingers lightly tapping against the armrest of his first-class seat. From the outside, they looked like any elderly couple enjoying the fruits of a long, hard-working life. But appearances could be deceiving. Luther's sharp eyes scanned the cabin, noticing the subtle glances from other passengers, the ones that silently questioned whether they truly belonged there. It wasn't the first time. It wouldn't be the last. Luther and Gloria weren't just any couple. They were the backbone of Haywood Aviation, one of the largest private stakeholders in Skyline Airways. It was a venture they had built from the ground up, born out of years of resilience, business acumen, and an unwavering belief that success was the best form of resistance. Luther, once a prominent civil rights attorney, had transitioned into the corporate world, using his keen understanding of systemic inequality to create opportunities for those who had long been denied them. Gloria, a former educator and community leader, now spearheaded the Haywood Foundation, a philanthropic organization dedicated to empowering marginalized communities through education and entrepreneurship. But they never flaunted their success. Instead, they used it strategically. Every quarter they flew commercial, always first class, always unannounced. It was part of their covert evaluation system for Skyline Airways. They believed in leading from behind the scenes, ensuring that the service provided by the airline reflected the values they stood for. This trip was supposed to be routine, a quiet check-in to see how the airline treated its passengers, especially those who didn't fit the traditional mold of first-class clientele. The decision to fly this particular route wasn't random. Just 6 months prior, a complaint had quietly crossed Luther's desk. A black family in first class had been subjected to cold, dismissive service from the cabin crew. The incident had been handled, according to the corporate report, but Luther knew better. Handled often meant swept under the rug. He and Gloria had decided to see for themselves if the culture had truly changed. As they settled into their seats, Gloria sighed softly, her hand brushing against Luther's. She wasn't just tired from travel. She was tired of the fight that never seemed to end. "You'd think after all these years we wouldn't have to keep doing this," she murmured. Luther smiled faintly, squeezing her hand. "The moment we stop paying attention is the moment. The system slips back into old habits." The flight had barely reached cruising altitude when the first red flag appeared. Luther had pressed the call button, not expecting trouble, just requesting a simple glass of water for Gloria, who was feeling a bit dehydrated after their layover. Clara Reynolds, the senior flight attendant, had responded with a tight smile and an even tighter tone. "Water will be served with the meal service," she said, her eyes flicking over them with a barely concealed judgment. It wasn't just about protocol. It was about perception, who deserved kindness and who didn't. Luther didn't press the issue then. He simply nodded, his mind already turning over the implications. He'd seen this play out too many times. Quiet discrimination, dressed up as policy, exclusion masked as efficiency. He leaned toward Gloria and whispered, "Phase 1 activated." Gloria glanced at him, understanding immediately. This was no longer just a routine flight. It was a test Clara Reynolds was already failing. The couple's presence in first class wasn't just about comfort. It was about accountability. Luther had long believed that power, when wielded wisely, could transform not just individual lives but entire systems, and Skyline Airways was their system, They had built it, invested in it, trusted it to reflect their values. When it failed, it wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a betrayal of everything they stood for. The memories of past battles lingered. Luther recalled the early days of Haywood Aviation, when banks refused to grant loans to a black-owned aviation startup, when competitors tried to undercut their bids, when industry veterans dismissed them as outsiders who didn't belong in the skies. But they had pushed through, not just for themselves, but for every person who had ever been told they were less than. That's why this flight mattered. It wasn't about a glass of water. It was about respect, about dignity, about ensuring that no passenger, regardless of race, age, or background, ever felt unwelcome in a space they had every right to occupy. Luther glanced down at his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen. A pre-drafted message awaited, ready to be sent with a single tap. Phase 2 monitor service, log infractions, await further instruction. He didn't send it yet. He wanted to give Clara a chance, a moment to correct her course, to choose kindness over prejudice. But deep down he already knew how this would end. And when it did, the consequences would reach far beyond the cabin of this plane. Because Luther and Gloria Haywood weren't just passengers, they were the architects of the very airline Clara believed she controlled. And soon, she'd learn the truth the hard way. Luther Haywood pressed the call button for the second time, his expression calm but purposeful. Gloria sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on her lap, fingers slightly curled as if she were holding onto the last thread of patience. Her breathing had grown shallow, and the soft sheen of sweat on her brow betrayed her discomfort. The cabin hummed quietly with the sound of the engines, the lull of a routine flight masking the tension brewing in the first-class section. Clara, Reynolds, the senior flight attendant, strode down the aisle with the same air of practiced indifference. Her uniform was immaculate, her posture rigid. She had been in this role for over a decade, and in her mind, she knew exactly which passengers deserved attention and which ones were better left ignored. As she approached Luther and Gloria's row, her eyes flicked toward them, her lips tightening ever so slightly. "Can I help you with something?" Her tone was clipped, businesslike, devoid of the warmth she had shown moments earlier to the white couple in 1A and 1B. Luther smiled politely, his voice steady. "My wife is feeling dehydrated. We asked for a glass of water earlier, but it hasn't come. If you could bring one now, we'd appreciate it." Clara's eyes narrowed. "As I said before, water will be served with the meal service. We have a schedule for a reason." Luther held her gaze, his smile unwavering. "I understand the schedule, ma'am, but this isn't about convenience. It's about her health." The corners of Clara's mouth twitched downward. "Sir, if I start making exceptions, I'll be running up and down the aisle all flight. I'm sure your wife can wait like everyone else." Nearby passengers glanced over, some quickly looking away while others exchanged knowing looks. The silent judgment was palpable, hanging in the air like smoke. Luther's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "I see. Thank you for clarifying." Satisfied that she had asserted her authority, Clara turned sharply and walked away, her heels clicking against the plush carpet. Gloria, watching quietly, reached over and squeezed Luther's hand. "Let it go," she whispered. "It's not worth it." But Luther's mind was already working. He had seen this play out too many times before, the subtle dismissal, the unspoken belief that people like them didn't belong in spaces like this. He leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly, and reached into his pocket. His fingers brushed against his phone, and without hesitation he typed a brief message: "Activate Phase 2." Across the aisle, a white man in a crisp business suit pressed his own call button. Clara appeared almost instantly, her expression softening into a practiced smile. "Yes, sir? Could I get a glass of water, please?" he asked, not even looking up from his tablet. "Of course," Clara said smoothly, already reaching for the pitcher from her service cart. She poured the water into a crystal-clear glass, added a napkin for presentation, and placed it gently on the man's tray table. "Let me know if you need anything else." Luther watched the exchange in silence, his face an unreadable mask. Gloria, too, saw it and let out a quiet sigh. She didn't need to say it out loud. The message was clear. The rules weren't the same for everyone. From the galley, Kim, the junior flight attendant, observed the scene with growing discomfort. She had been trained to treat all passengers equally, but reality had taught her otherwise. Still, something about this particular situation gnawed at her. The couple wasn't being unreasonable, it was just water. Why was Clara pushing back so hard? Kim hesitated, glancing toward the service cart. She could easily pour a glass herself and slip it to them without fuss. But Clara's stern warning earlier echoed in her mind. If you want to last in first class, you follow my lead. We don't cater to every whim, especially when it's obvious some folks are just testing boundaries. Boundaries. That word lingered heavy with unspoken meaning. Kim took a deep breath and stepped forward, determination hardening her resolve. She reached for a glass, but before she could pour, Clara's voice cut through the cabin like a whip. "Kim, what do you think you're doing?" Kim froze, glass in hand. "The lady in 2B doesn't look well. I was just..." Clara's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Passengers can wait for the scheduled service. Put that down." Reluctantly, Kim set the glass back on the tray, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. Passengers nearby exchanged uneasy glances, some pretending not to notice while others watched with thinly veiled curiosity. In the midst of it all, Luther's phone vibrated softly on the tray table. He glanced at the screen. Message received. Ground team alerted. He looked over at Gloria, who gave him a tired smile. "You're really going through with this," she murmured. Luther's expression didn't waver. "It's not just about us. It never is." Across the aisle, the man in the business suit sipped his water, oblivious to the storm quietly brewing around him. Clara moved on, her posture straight, her authority reaffirmed. She believed she had won this round, but what she didn't realize was that she had just crossed a line she couldn't retreat from. What do you think? Was Clara simply following protocol, or was this something more? Comment number 1 if you believe the couple deserved better treatment, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss another story like this. But here's the real question. What happens when the people you think you're controlling turn out to hold the real power? Stay tuned, because this flight is far from over. The hum of the engines filled the first-class cabin as Clara Reynolds strutted back toward the galley, her shoulders squared with the self-assuredness of someone who believed they'd just put a troublesome passenger in their place. She didn't glance back at Luther or Gloria. In her mind, the matter was settled. They'd asked, she'd denied, and the rules had been upheld. As far as she was concerned, the couple in 2A and 2B would sit quietly for the remainder of the flight, humbled and compliant, just like so many others she'd dismissed over the years. But Luther wasn't like the others. His gaze followed Clara's, retreating figure with quiet calculation. He had spent his life fighting battles far more challenging than a dismissive flight attendant. He knew how systems worked, how they protected those in power while silencing those deemed insignificant. And he also knew how to dismantle those systems piece by piece without ever raising his voice. Kim, the junior flight attendant, lingered near the galley, her lips pressed into a thin line. She had seen discrimination on flights before, sometimes subtle, sometimes overt, but something about this incident gnawed at her. Maybe it was the quiet dignity of the elderly couple, or the way Clara had smiled while denying such a simple request. Either way, it didn't sit right. Clara, noticing Kim's hesitation, raised an eyebrow. "Don't tell me you're still thinking about that water," she muttered, reaching for the service tablet to check the meal schedule. Kim swallowed hard. "It's just, she didn't look well. It wouldn't have taken more than a minute." Clara's smile was cold. "So you'll learn, Kim. In first class, it's about maintaining control. Give one person special treatment and suddenly everyone's entitled. They need to know their place." Kim blinked, stunned by the bluntness of the statement. She glanced back toward Luther and Gloria, who sat quietly, hands intertwined, the picture of resilience. It wasn't about water. It never was. Meanwhile, Luther's phone vibrated again. He glanced down at the message, "Ground team notified, monitoring the situation. Phase 2 confirmed." He slipped the phone back into his pocket without a word. Gloria shifted slightly in her seat, her face pale, lips dry. Luther leaned closer. "How are you holding up?" he asked softly. Gloria offered a faint smile. "I've been through worse. But it's the principle, Luther. It always is." Nearby, the man in 1A, still sipping his chilled water, glanced toward the couple and quickly looked away. Passengers were noticing, but no one was speaking up. That, Luther knew, was the real power of systemic bias. Silence from those who witnessed it, but chose comfort over confrontation. The first turbulence of the flight rumbled through the cabin, causing a few passengers to glance up. Clara barely noticed. She was busy chatting with Heather Langley, the purser, who had just returned from checking the economy cabin. "They're still pressing the call button?" Heather asked, her tone laced with amusement. "Not since I shut them down," Clara replied smugly. "Entitlement's a hell of a drug," Heather chuckled, shaking her head. "You'd think they'd be grateful to even sit up here." Kim, standing a few feet away, stiffened. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. These weren't just offhand comments. They were reflections of a mindset that had clearly been reinforced for years. But what could she do? Speaking up against senior staff meant risking her job, and she'd worked too hard to get here. Still, her conscience nagged at her. She quietly grabbed an empty glass, intending to pour water anyway, but Clara caught her wrist, her grip surprisingly firm. "Don't," Clara hissed. "You're not here to play savior. You're here to follow orders." Kim pulled her hand back, heart pounding. She glanced toward Luther, who was watching the exchange with the calm patience of a man who had seen this play out countless times. His restraint wasn't born of submission, but of strategy. He knew the long game, and Clara had just unknowingly placed herself as the next pawn to fall. Further down the aisle, Zoe, the white teenager seated across from the couple, whispered to her mother, "Did you see that? She gave water to the guy in front but told them no." Her mother frowned but didn't respond, instead flipping through the in-flight magazine with forced nonchalance. Zoe, frustrated by the inaction, pulled out her phone and started recording quietly, her camera angled toward the unsuspecting Clara and the elderly couple. Heather, now seated near the galley, glanced at the tablet and muttered, "We've still got another 3 hours of this flight." "Let's hope they don't get any more ideas," Clara smirked. "They won't. People like that know when they've lost, but Clara was wrong. This wasn't a loss. It was a countdown, and the clock was ticking faster than she realized. The first-class cabin settled into an uneasy quiet. Clara Reynolds moved through the aisle with the confidence of someone who believed they had already won. She ignored the glances from a few curious passengers, brushing off the tension like lint from her uniform. In her mind, she had done her job, upheld the rules, maintained order. The elderly black couple in 2A and 2B had been handled. Problem solved, but for Luther Haywood, the problem was far from solved. It was only unfolding. Gloria shifted in her seat, her face pale and drawn. The flush of dehydration deepened the lines around her eyes. Luther noticed immediately. He reached for her hand, the warmth of her skin concerningly faint against his own. His jaw tightened. This wasn't just about indignity anymore. This was about health, her health. He pressed the call button again. The soft chime echoed through the cabin. Clara glanced over, saw the light above their seat, and deliberately turned away. A white passenger 2 rows ahead, a middle-aged woman, in a tailored blazer, flagged Clara down for a refill of her coffee. Clara was there in an instant, smile polished and tone pleasant. "Of course, Mum," Clara chirped, pouring the steaming liquid into the pristine cup. "Anything else I can get you?" The woman shook her head, already turning back to her. "Tablet." Clara glanced once more at the illuminated call light above Luther and Gloria's seats and smirked. Luther sat quietly, his phone resting on the tray table. He didn't look irritated. He didn't argue. He didn't even press the call button again. He simply typed another message. "Escalate. Confirm Phase 2. Kim, the junior flight attendant, hovered near the galley, watching everything unfold with increasing discomfort. She had seen favoritism before, an extra blanket for a frequent flyer, an upgraded meal for a VIP. But this wasn't favoritism. This was deliberate, targeted neglect. Unable to stay silent any longer, Kim stepped forward, her heart pounding. She approached Clara near the service station, voice low but firm. "Clara, the woman in 2B really doesn't look good. Can't we just give her some water? It's not like it'll derail the flight. Clara spun around, eyes narrowing. Kim, if you want to keep working in first class, you need to understand how things are done here. They're fine. They're just pushing boundaries. You can't let them think they can bend the rules. Kim blinked, stunned by the bluntness of the words. It's just water, Clara. It's never just water, Clara snapped. It's about control. The words hung in the air, sharp and cold. Kim took a step back, heart sinking. She had always known there were unspoken rules, but hearing them voiced so plainly made her stomach churn. Meanwhile, Gloria leaned her head back, eyes fluttering closed. Her breathing had grown shallow. Luther leaned toward her, voice soft. Gloria, stay with me. She gave a weak nod, squeezing his hand. But Luther had seen enough. His patience had never been passivity. It had been calculation, precision. He picked up his phone once more, his fingers moving swiftly across the screen. Passenger health compromised. Prioritize Phase 3. Across the cabin, Zoe, the teenager who had been quietly recording earlier, glanced up from her phone. She'd posted the first video already, a 30-second clip showing Clara denying water to the elderly couple while serving other passengers without hesitation. The caption read, "First-class service, but not for everyone." Her phone buzzed. 10K views, then another ping, 25K views. The numbers climbed by the second. Zoe nudged her mom, who looked up from her magazine. "Mom, this is blowing up." Her mother frowned at the screen, lips tightening. "Put that away, Zoe, it's not our business." "But it is our business," Zoe muttered, angling her phone to capture another shot. In the frame, Clara stood chatting with Heather Langley, the purser, both of them laughing quietly while Luther sat silently beside his visibly wilting wife. Heather, noticing the phone, leaned toward Clara. "You've got an audience," she muttered, nodding toward Zoe. Clara's smile tightened. "Let them record. Nothing's going to come of it." Luther watched it all unfold with the composure of a man who had fought far greater battles. He glanced down at his phone. Phase 3 confirmed. Ground team preparing. He turned to Gloria, brushing a stray curl from her forehead. "Just a little longer, love," he murmured. "The system always thinks it's untouchable, until it's not." What do you think? Was Clara truly following protocol, or was this pure discrimination? At play? Comment number 1 if you believe the couple deserved better treatment. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss another story like this. But here's the real question. When someone abuses their power for too long, what happens when the tables finally turn? Stay tuned, because this flight is about to hit turbulence. The plane cruised smoothly at 35,000 feet, but inside the first-class cabin, the tension was anything but calm. Clara Reynolds moved briskly through the aisle, her expression sharp, her movements efficient. To her, the situation was handled. The elderly couple had been put in their place, and the junior flight attendant, Kim, had been reminded of her own. The balance of control was restored, just the way Clara liked it. But control, as Clara was about to learn, was an illusion. Luther sat quietly, his arm resting protectively around Gloria's shoulders. Her breathing had steadied, though her complexion remained pale. She leaned her head against Luther's shoulder, eyes half closed. From the outside, they looked like any other tired couple on a long-haul flight, but inside Luther's mind, the wheels were turning. His phone vibrated again. He glanced down at the message, ground team in position, awaiting next move. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. He simply locked the screen and placed the phone face down on the tray table. There was no need for urgency. The system was already in motion. Across the aisle, Zoe's phone buzzed incessantly. Her video, now uploaded with the caption "Denied water in first class because they're black," had exploded. 75,000 views, then 150,000. Comments flooded in, most outraged, some dismissive, but all fueling the fire. Zoe's eyes widened as she watched the numbers climb. "Mom, look at this," she whispered, nudging her mother, who reluctantly leaned over. Her mother's face tightened. "Turn it off, Zoe. You don't want to get involved." "But it's already happening," Zoe murmured, glancing nervously toward Clara. who remained blissfully unaware of the digital storm brewing against her. Then it happened. A soft chime echoed through the cabin, different from the usual call button. It was the priority alert from the cockpit, a sound Clara rarely heard during routine service. She frowned, adjusting her scarf as she made her way toward the front of the plane. The captain's voice, calm but firm, crackled over the intercom. "Lead Flight Attendant Clara Reynolds, please report to the cockpit immediately." Heads turned. Passengers glanced up from their magazines and tablets. Even Kim, refilling coffee near the galley, froze. Clara's brow furrowed as she exchanged a glance with Heather, the purser. "What's that about?" Heather muttered, voice low. Clara shrugged, feigning nonchalance. Probably another ridiculous passenger complaint. But there was an edge to her voice, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She straightened her posture and walked briskly toward the cockpit, heels clicking against the plush carpet. Inside the cockpit, Captain Bryant Vance sat with a tablet in hand, his co-pilot quietly monitoring the flight systems. The captain's expression was neutral, but there was a certain tightness around his mouth as he handed the tablet to Clara. "Priority message from corporate," he said without preamble. "Read it." Clara blinked, caught off guard by the directness. She took the tablet, her eyes scanning the message. The words hit her like a slap. Passenger incident reported in first class. Subjects: Luther and Gloria Haywood, CEO stakeholders. Full executive oversight initiated. Document all further interactions. Immediate escalation protocol engaged upon landing. Clara's breath caught. CEO stakeholders? She reread the message, heart pounding. Haywood. The name rang a bell, faint but undeniable. Panic fluttered in her chest, but she masked it quickly. Her years of experience kicking in. This has to be a mistake, she stammered, looking up at the captain. "They're just passengers?" Captain Vance interrupted, his gaze steely. "Passengers who, according to corporate, own a significant stake in the airline you're representing right now." Clara's mouth opened, then closed. She gripped the tablet tighter, her knuckles whitening. The captain leaned forward, voice dropping to a warning tone. "Clara, I don't care how you normally handle things up here. This isn't a routine complaint. You've got eyes on you from the ground now. I suggest you tread carefully." Clara swallowed hard, the weight of the situation sinking in. She handed the tablet back with a forced smile. "Understood, Captain. I'll handle it." But as she turned and exited the cockpit, her mind spun wildly. This couldn't be happening. They couldn't be those Haywoods. It didn't make sense. People like that didn't just fly commercial. They had private jets, luxury charters. They didn't quietly sit in first class, pressing call buttons like common passengers. Her pace slowed as she re-entered the cabin. She glanced toward 2A and 2B, really looking at the couple for the first time. Luther sat with quiet poise, his fingers tapping idly on his phone, as though the entire world weren't shifting beneath Clara's feet. Gloria, though visibly tired, held an air of quiet elegance, her pearl earrings catching the soft cabin light. Clara's heart pounded. She'd made a mistake, a big one. But instead of softening, her pride flared. She'd worked too hard, climbed too high, to let some passengers, stakeholders, or not, undermine her authority. She squared her shoulders, pushing down the gnawing sense of dread. As she passed Zoe, the teenager's phone screen flashed with another notification: 200K views. First class bias trending. Clara didn't notice. She was too busy convincing herself that she still had control. She didn't realize it yet, but the ground beneath her had already shifted. The power she clung to so tightly was no longer hers to wield. It belonged to the very people she had dismissed without a second thought. And they were about to remind her exactly who they were. Clara Reynolds strode down the aisle, her polished smile returning as she processed the bombshell from the cockpit. The Haywoods, stakeholders, corporate oversight. It rattled her, but not enough to shake her confidence completely. In her mind, this was just another overblown passenger complaint. She'd seen entitled flyers throw their weight around before, flashing elite status and empty threats. This would blow over. It always did. But Clara wasn't just dealing with another disgruntled passenger. She was dealing with Gloria Haywood, a man who had built his empire on understanding systems, finding their weaknesses, and turning them against those who misused power. And right now, Clara was the embodiment of that misuse. Gloria shifted in, her seat, eyes half closed. Luther glanced at her, concern flickering across his usually composed face. He reached for the call button again. The soft chime rang out and Clara's smile vanished. "Again?" she muttered under her breath, glancing at Heather Langley, the purser. "Can you believe this?" Heather sighed, clearly irritated. Some people don't know when to quit. Clara's steps quickened. She reached their row, arms crossed, her voice laced with thinly veiled condescension. "Sir, I've already explained this. Water will be served during meal service. Continuing to press the call button won't change airline policy." Luther's eyes met hers, calm but unwavering. "My wife's health doesn't run on your schedule, Miss Reynolds." Clara's smile thinned. "I suggest you both get comfortable and wait like everyone else." Nearby passengers watched the exchange with growing discomfort. Zoe, the teenager still filming discreetly, captured every word. Her video was already trending under that in first-class bias, climbing past 250K views. Kim, the junior flight attendant, hesitated near the galley, hands clenched at her sides. She'd had enough. Heart pounding, she stepped forward. "Clara, this isn't..." "Right, Mrs. Haywood looks unwell. It's just water." Clara spun around, her professionalism cracking. "Kim, stay in your lane. You're here to serve, not question senior staff." Kim flushed, shame and anger warring on her face. She stepped back, but her gaze lingered on the couple, silently apologizing. Luther watched the power play without reaction. He didn't need to speak. The system was already working in the background. His phone vibrated once more. Phase 3 confirmed. Corporate team notified. Social media team engaged. Clara, oblivious to the digital firestorm building against her, turned to Heather with a smirk. "They're just trying to play the victim card. I've seen it before. Shut it down and they'll fall in line." Heather nodded, her authority unquestioned. She stepped forward, voice sharp. "Sir, ma'am, if you continue to disrupt service, we'll have no choice but to file a formal complaint with the airline. Do I make myself clear?" Gloria opened her eyes, her voice soft but cutting. "Crystal clear. You've made your position painfully obvious." Luther said nothing. He simply reached for his phone, typed a final message and set it down, face up on the tray table. The screen glowed with one line. Phase 4. Initiate media protocol. The plane hummed along its route, but the real turbulence was brewing inside. The cabin. Whispers spread among passengers. Some exchanged nervous glances, others openly frowned. Zoe's mother, who had previously dismissed her daughter's concerns, now looked uneasy. Kim retreated to the galley, heart pounding. She'd seen injustice before, but never this blatant, and never with consequences looming so close. Clara stood tall, convinced she had won. She believed she'd maintained order, reinforced authority, and silenced dissent. She didn't realize she'd just stepped over the final line. What do you think? Was Clara simply enforcing airline policy, or was this a clear abuse of power? Comment number 1 if you believe the Haywoods deserved fair treatment. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more stories that uncover the truth. But here's the real question. When someone holds power for too long, what happens when that power is stripped away? The answer is coming, and it won't be what you expect. Stay tuned. The cabin hummed with quiet conversation, the soft clinking of glasses, and the occasional rustle of pages turning. On the surface, everything seemed normal, but beneath that facade, tension crackled like static in the air. Clara Reynolds moved through the aisle with mechanical efficiency, her smile thin, her posture rigid. In her mind, she had put the situation to rest. The Haywoods had been silenced. The flight would land and life would move on, just as it always had. But this time, life wasn't moving on. It was unraveling, one notification at a time. Zoe sat cross-legged in her seat, phone in hand, eyes wide as she watched the numbers climb. The video she'd uploaded earlier had exploded. 250,000 views, then 300,000. Comments flooded in, most furious, some disbelieving, others sharing their own experiences of quiet discrimination. Her phone vibrated with a new notification. First-class bias now trending nationally. Zoe glanced up at her mother, whose face had shifted from dismissal to quiet concern. "Mum," Zoe whispered, "this is huge. People are talking about it everywhere." Her mother, lips pressed into a thin line, leaned closer, finally taking the phone from Zoe's hands. She scrolled through the comments, eyes narrowing. "Unbelievable, in 2025 and this still happens? Water. They asked for water. How heartless do you have to be?" "Fire her, fire them both. Airlines need to do better." Further down, someone had tagged the official Skyline Airways account. The company's social media team had already responded with a vague diplomatic statement. "We are aware of the situation and are conducting an internal review. Passenger well-being remains our top priority." Zoe's mother exhaled slowly. "This isn't just some teenager posting for attention," she muttered. This is real." Meanwhile, Luther sat quietly, eyes fixed on his phone screen. He wasn't checking notifications. He didn't need to. He already knew the gears were turning. The power of truth, once unleashed, was unstoppable. He simply waited, calm and composed, while the system that had once worked against him now turned in his favor. Gloria stirred beside him, her breathing steadier, but her face still pale. She glanced at her husband and smiled faintly. "You always did know how to pick your battles," she murmured. Luther squeezed her hand gently. "It's not just our battle anymore." Across the aisle, Kim stood near the galley, watching everything unfold with growing unease. She had seen passenger complaints escalate before, but nothing like this. The air felt charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. She glanced at Clara, who remained blissfully unaware, laughing quietly with Heather Langley, the purser. "They really think they've won," Kim muttered under her breath, but the illusion of victory was about to shatter. In the cockpit, Captain Bryant Vance frowned as another message flashed across his communications screen. It wasn't from air traffic control. It was from the airline's corporate headquarters. Situation escalated. Viral incident confirmed. Media monitoring active. Ensure lead flight attendant Reynolds complies with all passenger requests immediately. Full executive oversight initiated. Priority disembarkation for affected passengers. Do not engage further. The captain's jaw tightened. He flicked a switch, activating the intercom. "Lead flight attendant Clara Reynolds, please report to the cockpit immediately." The announcement cut through the cabin like a knife. Heads turned. Passengers glanced at one another, brows furrowed in confusion. But one face betrayed something more. Clara's. Her smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of irritation. She shot Heather a glance. "What now?" she muttered, smoothing her uniform before striding toward the front of the plane. Kim watched. Her go, heart pounding. Something was happening. Something big. Inside the cockpit, Captain Vance didn't mince words. He handed Clara the tablet displaying the latest corporate directive. She scanned the message, her face draining of color with each line. "This can't be serious," she muttered, voice thin. "They're just passengers." The captain's gaze hardened. "Passengers who own part of the airline, Reynolds. Passengers whose complaint has now gone viral. You've got eyes on you from corporate, from the media, from every corner of the internet. This is no longer your call." Clara stood frozen, the weight of her actions crashing down like an avalanche. For the first time, control slipped from her grasp, and she had nothing to hold on to. The captain's voice sharpened. "You will return to the cabin. You will address the situation professionally, and you will not, under any circumstances, escalate. Further, do I make myself clear?" Clara swallowed hard, nodding stiffly. "Yes, Captain." But clarity didn't bring calm. It brought panic. As she exited the cockpit, her mind raced. She couldn't believe it. The Haywoods, those Haywoods, they didn't look like power players. They didn't act entitled. They had simply asked for water. How had it come to this? Passing row 2, Clara's eyes met Luther's for the briefest moment. He didn't speak, he didn't smirk, he didn't gloat. He simply watched her, calm and patient, like a man who had already won the war without ever raising his voice. Clara's chest tightened. She hurried back to the galley, grabbing Heather's arm. "We've got a problem," she hissed. Heather frowned. "What now?" "They're not just passengers," Clara whispered, voice strained. "They own part of the damn airline." Heather's eyes widened, her grip on the service tablet tightening. "You're joking." "I wish I was," Clara snapped. "Corporates watching. We're under a microscope." Heather glanced toward the cabin where passengers were now murmuring, some checking their phones, others side-eyeing Clara with newfound awareness. The story was no longer contained to seat 2A and 2B. It had spread like wildfire. Kim, overhearing the frantic exchange, took a slow step back. Her heart pounded in her chest, but this time it wasn't fear. It was vindication. The system was finally cracking. At the front of the cabin, Zoe's phone buzzed again. She glanced down and gasped. 500K views. National news outlets now covering the story. Several verified accounts had shared the video, including civil rights organizations and prominent journalists. The headline flashing across social media was damning. Elderly black couple denied water in first class. Turns out they own the airline. Zoe's eyes widened. She nudged her mum again, holding up the phone. "Look, it's everywhere." Her mother's face paled. She glanced toward Clara, whose stiff posture betrayed her spiraling panic. This isn't just a complaint," her mother muttered. "This is a reckoning," and the reckoning was far from over. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin thickened, no longer just with tension but with anticipation. Passengers murmured quietly, eyes flicking between the elderly couple in 2A and 2B and the flight attendants now huddled near the galley. The glow of phone screens illuminated several faces. Many were reading the trending hashtag #OneFirstClassBias. Others were quietly recording, knowing they were witnessing something bigger than an ordinary in-flight dispute. Clara Reynolds stood frozen, near the galley, her heart pounding as the reality of her situation fully settled in. The Haywoods weren't just passengers. They weren't even just elite travelers. They were stakeholders in the very airline she worked for. The very system she thought had her back was now scrutinizing her every move. Heather Langley, the purser, leaned in, voice low but sharp. "Okay, Clara, what's the plan here? We can't just ignore corporate's directive." Clara's jaw clenched. "I'm not groveling. They made a scene. They can wait for meal service like everyone else." Kim, the junior flight attendant, stood nearby, arms crossed tightly. She'd had enough. "This isn't about a scene, Clara. It's about how you treated them. Everyone saw it. Everyone's still seeing it." She nodded toward Zoe, the teenager, whose phone buzzed with endless notifications. "That video, it's over 500,000 views now." Clara's face flushed. She opened her mouth to snap back, but before a word could escape, the priority chime sounded again. The captain's voice came over the intercom, tight and controlled. "Lead flight attendant Clara Reynolds, please report to the cockpit. Immediately." Passengers exchanged glances. Zoe's eyes widened. She whispered to her mom, "This is it. Something's happening." Clara stiffened, her mask of professionalism cracking. Without another word, she marched toward the cockpit, heels clicking sharply against the carpet. Heather followed, lips pressed into a thin line. Inside the cockpit, Captain Vance didn't bother with pleasantries. He handed Clara another tablet, the screen flashing with a new directive from corporate headquarters. But this time, the sender's name stood out. Angela Mercer, COO, Skyline Airways. Clara's breath caught. Angela Mercer wasn't just an executive. She was one of the few black women in a top leadership role within the aviation industry. Known for her no-nonsense approach, Mercer had built her career dismantling the very kind of systemic bias Clara had unknowingly embodied. The message was brutally clear. Flight crew is to comply with all passenger requests from Mr. and Mrs. Haywood immediately. Any further refusal will result in immediate suspension pending investigation. Full executive oversight initiated upon landing. Ensure discretion. COO Mercer monitoring in real time. Clara's hand tightened around the tablet. Her throat went dry. Suspension? Investigation? This couldn't be happening, not over water. Captain Vance's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. "You heard the order. Comply. Now." Clara's pride flared, but she bit back her protest. She'd lost control, and she knew it. Turning on her heel, she stormed back into the cabin, Heather trailing behind. Kim watched them return, noting the rigid set of Clara's shoulders, the way her hands clenched and unclenched at her sides. Something had shifted. Kim's heart lifted, with cautious hope. Maybe, just maybe, justice was finally catching up. Clara stopped beside Luther and Gloria's seats, her smile forced and brittle. "Mr. Haywood, Mrs. Haywood," she began, her voice tight. "I apologize for the earlier inconvenience. May I get you that water now?" Luther looked up slowly, his gaze steady, unreadable. He didn't answer immediately, letting the silence stretch just long enough for Clara to squirm. Finally he spoke, voice calm but firm. "It's not about the water, Miss Reynolds. It never was." Clara's lips parted, but no words came out. She stood there, exposed, the power dynamic completely reversed. Passengers nearby watched with thinly veiled curiosity. Zoe, still filming, whispered, "I can't believe this is actually happening." Gloria, ever composed despite her discomfort, offered a faint smile. "But since you're offering," she said softly, "I'd appreciate that water now." Clara stiffened, then spun toward the galley. Kim, unable to suppress a satisfied exhale, stepped forward and intercepted her. "I'll handle it," Kim said, brushing past without waiting for permission. Moments later, Kim returned with 2 glasses of chilled water, condensation beading on the surface. She handed one to Gloria with a warm smile. "I'm sorry it took this long, Mum." Gloria accepted the glass with a graceful nod. "Thank you, dear, it's not your fault." Luther watched the exchange, his face unreadable. He glanced down at his phone. Message sent. Media protocol fully engaged. He set the device down without another look. Meanwhile, Heather Langley leaned close to Clara, voice urgent but hushed. "We've got another problem. Mercer's directive mentioned media monitoring. They're not just watching us internally. News outlets have picked it up. This is national." "Now," Clara's stomach dropped. "National? Over this?" As if to confirm Heather's words, Zoe's phone buzzed again. She glanced down and gasped. "Mom, CNN just tweeted the video." Passengers around her murmured in disbelief. The quiet tension that had hovered over the cabin now snapped into something sharper, more electric. Whispers spread like wildfire. "Did you hear? They own the airline. The CEO's watching this live? God, she's done. There's no coming back from this." Kim, standing near the galley, caught Luther's eye. He gave her the smallest nod of acknowledgement. She nodded back, her chest tightening with emotion. She had doubted whether speaking up mattered. Now she knew. It did. As Clara stood frozen, processing the full scope of her downfall, another chime echoed through the cabin. This time it was the captain's voice, steady and cool. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our initial descent into Los Angeles. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for landing." Clara swallowed hard. Her career wasn't just unraveling. It was plummeting, and there was nothing she could do to pull it out of the nosedive. What do you think? Did Clara deserve this fallout, or was it all blown out of proportion? Comment number 1 if you believe the Haywoods were right to stand their ground, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more stories that reveal the truth behind the facade. But here's the real question. Now that the system has turned against her, how far will Clara go to protect herself? Stay tuned, because the landing is going to be rough. The soft chime signaling the plane's descent echoed through the cabin, but the mood inside first class was anything but routine. Passengers murmured quietly, some exchanging glances, others pretending not to notice the drama unfolding around them. Phones buzzed with notifications as the hashtag #Dar First Class Bias continued to trend. Every few seconds, Zoe's screen lit up with comments and reposts, pushing the video further into the digital spotlight. Clara Reynolds returned to the galley, her face pale, her steps stiff. She had done what corporate ordered, offered the Haywoods water, but the victory felt hollow. No, worse than hollow. It felt like the first crack in a dam about to burst. Heather Langley, the purser, leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Well," she muttered, "that was humiliating. I've never seen corporate intervene mid-flight like that." Clara didn't respond. She was too busy pulling out her own phone, her mind racing. This couldn't be how her career ended, not after years of clawing her way to the top. She'd followed the rules. She'd maintained order. If the passengers had just accepted the service as it was outlined, none of this would have happened, but they hadn't. And now the system that once protected her was turning against her. Her phone buzzed, a text from her union rep. Saw the war. Video, corporates on a warpath. Don't say anything more to the passengers. I'm escalating this to our legal team. Stay calm. We'll fight this. Clara's breath hitched. Fight this. The words ignited something inside her, a flicker of defiance. She had seen complaints before, even faced disciplinary hearings, but nothing had ever stuck. Why? Because the system wasn't built to hold people like her accountable. It was built to protect them, and she still knew how to play the game. Sliding her phone into her pocket, Clara straightened her uniform and strode toward the purser's station. Heather glanced up, eyebrow raised. What now? We're not done, Clara hissed. They want to play hardball? Fine. Let's see how they like it when the tables turn. Heather frowned. Clara, don't be stupid. Corporate's already breathing down our necks. Clara ignored her. She tapped the service tablet, pulling up the in-flight incident report system. Her fingers flew across the screen as she filed a formal complaint, not against the Haywoods, but against Luther specifically. Passenger, in 2A, exhibiting aggressive behavior toward crew. Refused to comply with standard service procedures. Created a disruptive atmosphere, causing discomfort to other passengers. Immediate security review required upon landing. Clara smiled grimly as she hit submit. The system didn't ask for proof. It didn't need to. The word of senior staff, especially a lead flight attendant with her tenure, carried weight. Enough weight to trigger a flag at LAX security. Heather's eyes widened as she glanced over Clara's shoulder. You filed a disruptive passenger. A report, are you insane? Clara shrugged, her mask of professionalism snapping back into place. They embarrassed me. Cost me my authority in front of an entire cabin. You think I'm walking off this plane like some disgraced rookie? No, if I'm going down, I'm not going alone. Heather stepped back, horror dawning on her face. This isn't some petty argument, Clara. You're escalating a situation that corporate already told us to stand down on. Clara's smile didn't waver. Corporate's not here. I am. At the front of the cabin, Kim returned from checking the economy section, her heart sinking as she saw Clara's smug expression. Something had shifted. Again. Luther, seated quietly beside Gloria, glanced at his phone. Another message from the ground team. Landing procedures underway. Priority escort confirmed. Stay seated until instructed. He exhaled slowly, rubbing his thumb over the back of Gloria's hand. Almost there, he murmured. Gloria nodded, but her eyes flicked toward Clara, who now stood with an air of restored confidence. She's not done, Gloria whispered. You see it, don't you? Luther's jaw tightened. He'd seen it countless times before. The system, when threatened, didn't just collapse quietly. It lashed out, desperate to protect itself. And people like Clara, they knew how to weaponize that desperation. The plane jolted slightly as it descended through a thin layer of clouds. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm but firm. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final approach into Los Angeles International Airport. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for landing. Kim, strapping herself into the jump seat near the galley, caught Clara's eye. What did you do? She asked quietly. Clara's smile widened. Nothing the manual doesn't allow, Kim's stomach churned. She glanced toward the Haywoods, who sat quietly, unaware of the trap being set around them. This wasn't just about pride anymore, this was retaliation. The wheels of the plane touched down with a smooth thud, and the cabin filled with the familiar rustle of passengers stretching, checking phones, and unbuckling seatbelts prematurely despite the illuminated signs. Overhead bins clicked open as some eager travelers reached for their bags. But the real drama was waiting just beyond the aircraft door. Luther's phone buzzed once more. This time, the message was stark. Security alert flagged under passenger. 2 suspected disruptive behavior. LAX ground team notified. He showed the screen to Gloria, whose eyes narrowed. They're trying to flip the narrative, she muttered. Luther nodded slowly, already typing a response. Clearance confirmed. Override false flag. Engage phase 5. Across the cabin, Zoe, still glued to her phone, gasped. Oh my God, Mom, look. She held up the screen, where a breaking news alert flashed across Twitter. Skyline Airways, under fire, as viral video exposes first-class discrimination. Company confirms full investigation underway. Her mother's face paled. This isn't just a flight incident anymore. It's a corporate crisis. The plane slowed as it taxied toward the gate. Passengers gathered their belongings, the usual chaos of disembarkation beginning. But in the front row, Luther and Gloria sat perfectly still, hands clasped, eyes forward. They knew the fight wasn't over. The system, even when cornered, never surrendered quietly. And Clara, she was still playing her final hand, unaware that the deck had already been reshuffled against her. As the aircraft door opened and the bridge connected, uniformed airport security personnel appeared just beyond the threshold. 2 officers stood stiffly, eyes scanning the cabin, waiting for instructions. Heather saw them first and paled. Clara, what did you do? Clara's smile returned, razor sharp. Told you, I'm not going down alone. But Clara had forgotten one crucial rule. When you build your power on injustice, the very system you weaponize can just as easily turn against you, and it was about to. The cabin buzzed with restless energy as the plane rolled toward the gate. Passengers shifted in their seats, unbuckling prematurely despite the illuminated seatbelt sign. The usual impatience of disembarkation filled the air, but under the surface, tension simmered like a pot about to boil over. Everyone sensed it, the quiet, sharp edge of something unresolved. Luther Haywood glanced out the window, his eyes narrowing as he caught sight of the uniformed airport security officers waiting just beyond the jet bridge. They stood stiffly, radios clipped to their shoulders, eyes scanning the approaching aircraft like hawks zeroing in on prey. Gloria, sitting beside him, followed his gaze. Security? She murmured, voice taut with disbelief. After everything? Luther didn't answer immediately. He was already reaching for his phone, thumbing through messages from the ground team. There it was, confirmation of a false, disruptive passenger report filed under his name. His jaw tightened. Clara had played her final card, and it was as dirty as he'd expected. They flagged me as a threat, Luther muttered quietly, showing Gloria the message. Standard escalation protocol. They're trying to flip the narrative. Gloria's lips thinned. Typical. When they can't justify mistreatment, they paint you as the problem. Across the aisle, Kim, the junior flight attendant, sat frozen in her jump seat. Her headset crackled softly with incoming communications from the ground crew. When she caught sight of the security officers through the open cockpit door, her stomach sank. She'd seen this tactic before, weaponizing authority to suppress accountability, but this time it felt personal and dangerous. Clara Reynolds stood near the galley, chin high, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with a tight, triumphant smile. In her mind, she'd regained control. The Haywoods had embarrassed her, undermined her authority, and made her look weak in front of passengers and corporate alike. But now they'd face consequences, real ones, the kind that didn't disappear with a polite apology or a corporate statement. Heather Langley, the purser, leaned in, voice urgent. Clara, what the hell did you do? You flagged them? After everything? Clara shrugged, smoothing her uniform. I followed protocol. They were disruptive. Security will sort it out. Heather's face darkened. You filed that report after corporate ordered us to stand down. If they find out, they won't, Clara snapped, eyes flicking toward Luther and Gloria. By the time corporate gets involved, they'll be off the plane, detained for further questioning. No one's going to listen to passengers making a fuss after they've been flagged. Kim, listening nearby, couldn't hold her tongue any longer. You're unbelievable, she muttered, standing abruptly. You're weaponizing the system to cover your own mistakes. Clara's smile didn't waver. I'm protecting the flight. If you can't see that, you don't belong in first class. The plane came to a complete stop. The seatbelt sign dinged off. Passengers sprang to their feet, yanking bags from overhead bins and murmuring quietly. But attention soon shifted forward as the two security officers stepped aboard, eyes scanning the cabin. "Flight lead Reynolds?" one officer asked, voice calm but firm. Clara stepped forward, her confidence radiating. "Yes, I filed the report. Passenger in 2A, Mr. Haywood, exhibited disruptive behavior toward crew, non-compliance with service protocol, requesting immediate removal for further questioning." The officer nodded, already moving down the aisle. Passengers quieted, sensing the shift from inconvenience to confrontation. Phones appeared in hands, cameras discreetly angled toward the developing scene. Kim's heart pounded. This was wrong, blatantly, cruelly wrong, and no one was stopping it. The officers reached row 2. Luther sat quietly, phone in hand, watching. Them approached with the calm of a man who'd been through this dance too many times before. Gloria sat upright, her hand tightening around her husband's. "Sir," one officer said, voice professional but cool, "we've received a report regarding disruptive behavior. We need you to step off the aircraft for further questioning." Luther didn't flinch. Instead, he held up his phone, thumb tapping once to highlight a message on the screen. He turned it so the officer could read clearly. "False flag identified. Executive override in progress. Stand down order issued. LAX corporate liaison en route." The officer blinked, clearly caught off guard. He stepped back, tapping his radio. "Control, confirm override order for passenger 2A. I repeat, confirm override." The response crackled back almost immediately. "Override confirmed. Passenger flagged under false report. Officer in charge instructed to stand down. Priority disembarkation authorized." The officer's posture shifted instantly, from assertive to apologetic. He glanced at Luther, then back toward Clara, whose face had drained of color. "Sir, ma'am," the officer said quietly, stepping aside, "we apologize for the inconvenience. You're free to disembark at your leisure." Murmurs swept through the cabin. Passengers exchanged incredulous glances. Zoe, the teenager who had been quietly filming the entire exchange, whispered excitedly to her mum, "Did you see that? They tried to pull him off the plane." Her mother, previously dismissive, now looked pale and uneasy. This is bigger than a service dispute." Clara's mask of professionalism shattered. "What do you mean override?" she snapped, stepping toward the officers. "I'm the lead on this flight. My report stands." But the officer was already shaking his head, one hand raised to silence her. "Not anymore, ma'am. The override came directly from Skyline Corporate. You're instructed to stand down immediately. Further escalation will result in disciplinary review." Clara stumbled back a step, eyes wide. Corporate. They'd bypassed her entirely. The very system she thought she controlled had turned against her in an instant. Luther stood slowly, helping Gloria to her feet. He glanced at Clara, offering a polite but unmistakably pointed smile. "You really thought the system would protect you, didn't you?" Clara's mouth opened, but no words came out. She stood frozen, watching as Luther and Gloria moved toward the front of the cabin, heads high, untouched, unbothered. Passengers parted for them like water around a stone. As they stepped onto the jet bridge, another figure appeared, Angela Mercer, COO of Skyline Airways. Dressed in a sharp navy suit, her expression was cool professionalism, wrapped around simmering anger. Her eyes locked onto Clara the moment she stepped into view. "Miss Reynolds," Mercer said quietly, stepping aboard. "Step aside. Now." Clara paled. This wasn't just a passenger complaint anymore. This was corporate-level intervention. And Mercer, she wasn't here to smooth things over. Mercer turned to the lead security officer. "Escort Mr. and Mrs. Haywood to the priority lounge. Ensure they're comfortable. Their ground transportation has been arranged." "Yes, ma'am," the officer replied without hesitation. The rest of the passengers watched in stunned silence as the Haywoods exited, heads held high, dignity intact. The very people Clara had tried to silence now walked off the plane under corporate protection, while she stood frozen, exposed, and powerless. Kim, still near the galley, exhaled slowly. Justice, long overdue, had finally landed. But the flight wasn't over for Clara Reynolds. not by a long shot, because when the system turns on those who once wielded its power unchecked, it doesn't just rebuke them, it devours them. The cabin had fallen into an eerie silence. Passengers who had once been eager to disembark now sat frozen, eyes darting between Clara Reynolds, the lead flight attendant, and Angela Mercer, the COO of Skyline Airways. The presence of such high-ranking corporate leadership on the jet bridge wasn't just unusual, it was unprecedented. Everyone could feel it. Something far beyond an in-flight service dispute was unraveling. Clara stood stiffly near the galley, her face pale, her carefully maintained poise shattered. The smug confidence she'd worn earlier, the belief that she could manipulate the system to her advantage, had vanished the moment Angela Mercer stepped aboard. Now she was just another employee under scrutiny, a cog in a machine she no longer controlled. Mercer's gaze remained fixed on Clara, sharp and unyielding. "Miss Reynolds," she said coldly, "step aside from the cabin door, now." Clara hesitated, mouth opening and closing without sound. This couldn't be happening. She had followed procedure, her procedure, the rules she had learned, reinforced and weaponized for years. Yet here she stood, stripped of authority, watched by passengers who had once feared her quiet, passive aggression. Heather Langley, the purser, stood near the service station, face pale. She didn't speak. There was nothing to say. The hierarchy they had relied on, the unspoken biases they had upheld, were collapsing in real time. Angela Mercer didn't wait for compliance. She nodded toward the security officer standing near the door. "Escort Miss Reynolds off the aircraft. She's to report directly to the Skyline Executive Lounge for immediate review. Her access badge is now inactive." Clara's eyes widened. "Inactive," she choked out, the word scraping her throat like sandpaper. "You're suspending me? For what? Following protocol?" Mercer's gaze didn't waver. "No, Miss Reynolds. You're being removed for gross misconduct, filing a falsified incident report, endangering passenger safety, and disregarding direct orders from corporate leadership." The words hit like physical blows. Clara stumbled back a step, bumping, into the galley counter. Passengers watched, some openly filming, others whispering behind hands and phones. Zoe, the teenager who had been quietly documenting the incident from the beginning, whispered excitedly to her mother, "Mom, they're actually pulling her off the plane." Her mother, once dismissive of Zoe's concerns, now watched with quiet horror. "This is career-ending," she muttered, shaking her head. "She did this to herself." Clara's mind raced. This couldn't be real. It was just water, just a seat, just another passenger who didn't fit the image of first class. She'd made judgment calls like this for years, and nothing had ever come of it. Why was this time different? The answer stood just beyond the threshold of the aircraft, Luther and Gloria Haywood, walking calmly down the jet bridge under the watchful escort of airline executives. They hadn't screamed, hadn't threatened, hadn't demanded retribution. They had simply held the system to its own standards, and the system, once forced to face its own reflection, had turned on the very people who upheld its biases. "I'm not going anywhere," Clara snapped, panic rising. "You can't just—" Mercer's expression didn't change. "Miss Reynolds, you are no longer authorized to perform duties under Skyline Airways. If you do not comply immediately, airport security will escort you in restraints." The threat wasn't theatrical. It was cold, procedural, and terrifyingly final. Clara's chest heaved. She glanced at Heather for support, but the purser looked away, distancing herself from the sinking ship. Even Kim, the junior flight attendant Clara had berated earlier, stood silently near the jump seat, arms crossed, eyes hard with quiet satisfaction. For the first time, Clara realized she was alone. The security officer stepped forward. "Miss Reynolds," he said evenly, "please come with me." Shaking with rage and disbelief, Clara had no choice but to comply. She grabbed her service bag from the galley, the weight of it unfamiliar and cumbersome. The walk down the aisle, her aisle, the domain she had once ruled with silent judgment and selective kindness, felt impossibly long. Passengers parted wordlessly, eyes fixed on her like spectators at an execution. Zoe's phone tracked every step, Near the exit, Kim couldn't hold back any longer. "You could have stopped this," she muttered quietly as Clara passed. "All you had to do was treat them like human beings." Clara's glare was venomous, but she said nothing. Words had lost their power. As she stepped onto the jet bridge, Mercer followed, speaking quietly into her Bluetooth headset. "I want a full incident report filed before they clear the aircraft. Make sure legal is looped in. No spin. Full accountability." Heather leaned against the galley counter, exhaling shakily. "God," she muttered under her breath. "It's really over for her." Kim didn't respond immediately. Her eyes followed Mercer, the Haywoods, and the officers escorting Clara down the brightly lit corridor. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but resolute. "Not just for her," Kim said. "For everyone who thought they'd never get caught." The rest of the passengers filed off the plane slowly, some avoiding eye contact, others still whispering about what they'd witnessed. The first-class cabin, once a quiet enclave of privilege and unspoken hierarchy, now felt exposed. Like a stage after the final act, the illusion shattered, the curtain pulled back to reveal the machinery behind the performance. Zoe, still filming, looked at her mom. "Do you still think it was just water?" Her mother didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. The bustle of Los Angeles International Airport buzzed around Clara Reynolds like white noise, but she heard none of it. Her ears rang, her vision narrowed, and the once familiar terminal now felt foreign and hostile. She stood stiffly near the jet bridge, frozen in place as Angela Mercer, the COO of Skyline Airways, watched her with the cold scrutiny of a judge deliberating sentencing. Passengers from the flight trickled past, some glancing at her, others ignoring her entirely. Zoe, the teenager whose video had ignited the entire firestorm, passed by with her mother. The phone in her hand flashed with another notification. 1.2 million views. Zoe caught Clara's eye and didn't look away. There was no malice, no gloating, just quiet recognition, the look of someone who had witnessed injustice and refused to look the other way. Clara turned her head sharply, unable to bear the weight of that gaze. Angela Mercer's voice cut through the fog. "Miss Reynolds, you've been instructed to remain here for further debriefing. Please follow me." Clara's throat tightened. She opened her mouth to protest, to defend herself, but the words died on her tongue. What defense was there? The video footage, the corporate override, the executive intervention, it was airtight. Her usual arsenal of excuses, protocol references, and thinly veiled superiority had been stripped away. Mercer didn't wait for a response. She turned sharply, leading the way down a side corridor away from the main terminal. Clara hesitated, glancing toward Heather Langley, the purser, who stood near the galley entrance, face pale and drawn. Heather shook her head slightly, a silent warning. Don't make it worse. But worse was already here. Clara followed, her steps stiff, heels clicking against the polished tile floor. The corridor led to a private conference room near the executive lounges, far from the bustling crowds, far from prying eyes. Inside, the room was sterile, coldly professional. A long glass table stretched across the center, flanked by sleek leather chairs. On the far side sat a man Clara immediately recognized, Dominic Carter, head of cabin crew operations. Carter's expression was unreadable, but the tightness around his mouth spoke volumes. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit down." "Miss Reynolds." Clara swallowed hard and obeyed, lowering herself into the seat as if the weight of her own actions had doubled. Mercer remained standing near the door, arms crossed, silent but watchful. Carter slid a tablet across the table. The screen flickered to life, displaying the formal incident report. Only now, it wasn't just her initial complaint against Luther Haywood. It was the entire case file updated in real time, with executive annotations and flagged inconsistencies. Clara's heart sank as she saw her own name highlighted in red at the top of the report. "Miss Reynolds," Carter began, his tone clipped and professional, "you filed a disruptive passenger report against Mr. Luther Haywood. That report triggered an automatic security flag, which would have led to his detainment and possible escalation if not for the corporate override. Do you deny this? Clara licked her lips, voice brittle. I filed the report based on behavior I believed was disruptive. He was pressing a call button, Mercer interrupted flatly, stepping forward. Requesting water, quietly advocating for his wife's comfort while you dismissed him. That's what you labeled disruptive. Clara's mouth snapped shut. She had nothing to counter the truth so plainly laid before her. Carter continued, flipping the tablet to another screen. This time it showed real-time analytics from social media. The original video Zoe had posted was now past 1.5 million views, with multiple major news outlets picking up the story. Headlines flashed across the screen. Denied water, denied dignity. Airline faces backlash over racist first-class incident. Skyline Airways under fire after elderly black couple harassed by flight crew. Passengers speak out, we saw it happen. Clara's breath came shallow and fast. This is being blown out of proportion, she muttered, clinging to the last shred of her pride. I followed protocol. They were challenging my authority. Carter's hand came down flat on the table, the sharp crack echoing in the sterile room. Your authority? He snapped, professionalism fraying at the edges. Your authority ended the moment you weaponized it to humiliate passengers who did nothing but ask for basic human decency. Silence hung heavy in the room. Clara, for the first time in years, had nothing to say. Mercer stepped forward, tablet in hand. Effective immediately, Miss Reynolds. You are placed on indefinite suspension pending final termination review. Your access to airline systems has been revoked. Security will escort you from the premises once this meeting concludes. Clara's eyes widened. Suspension? Termination? Her voice pitched higher, panic breaking through the facade. You can't... Carter cut her off. We can, and we will. The Haywoods aren't just stakeholders. They're part of the board overseeing diversity and equity initiatives. They didn't just report you. They triggered a full audit of first-class service practices across the entire airline. Clara's stomach twisted. This wasn't just about her. It was systemic change, and she was the cautionary tale. Mercer leaned in, her voice quiet but razor-sharp. You didn't just mistreat passengers, Miss Reynolds. You exposed the system's ugliest underbelly, and now the system is excising you like the rot you enabled. The finality in her tone left no room for argument. Clara sat frozen, staring at the tablet as her career, her identity, crumbled before her eyes. Outside the room, Luther and Gloria Haywood sat quietly in the executive lounge, sipping freshly brewed coffee provided by a flight concierge who now treated them with the deference they should have received from the start. Luther glanced at his phone, reading the latest corporate update confirming Clara's suspension. Gloria smiled faintly, shaking her head. It's never really about the water, is it? Luther chuckled softly, squeezing her hand. Never is. It's about who gets to decide who matters, and today they learned it's not them. Across the airport, the world moved on. Planes taking off, passengers rushing to gates, announcements crackling overhead. But for Clara Reynolds, time had stopped. She was no longer the gatekeeper, no longer the enforcer of silent prejudice, disguised as professionalism. She was just another person being escorted out of an airport. And this time, no system would protect her. The lesson here is clear. Power, when abused, never holds forever. Clara Reynolds believed her authority was unshakable, protected by the very system she had used to dismiss and humiliate passengers she deemed unworthy of respect. But what she failed to understand was that power built on injustice is fragile, and when those who have been oppressed find their voice, the system itself can be turned on its head. Luther and Gloria Haywood didn't just fight for a glass of water. They fought for dignity, respect, and equality, basic rights that should never be conditional. Their quiet strength exposed how easily discrimination hides behind corporate procedures and polite indifference. It showed how quickly prejudice can escalate when left unchecked, and how dangerous it becomes when weaponized by those in control. But perhaps the most powerful takeaway is this. Accountability doesn't just come from the top. It comes from ordinary people refusing to stay silent. Zoe, the teenager who filmed the incident, didn't have power in the traditional sense. Yet her decision to record and share what she saw ignited a movement that reached millions, forcing an entire corporation to confront its own biases. Kim, the junior flight attendant, stood at a crossroads and chose integrity over silence, knowing the risk to her career. And the passengers who whispered in discomfort but did nothing. They serve as a reminder that indifference can be as harmful as the injustice itself. So what would you have done if you were on that flight? Would you have spoken up like Zoe and Kim, or would you have remained silent, hoping someone else would act? Comment below with your thoughts, and if you believe in standing against injustice, no matter how small the moment may seem, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this story with others. Thank you for watching, and may we all choose courage over comfort, empathy over indifference, and justice over complacency. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and never underestimate the power of your voice.